Yo, what's going on guys, Khraze here. We're back into Outriders, of course, with your daily dose of news and gameplay, well, with the exception of tomorrow because I'm going to be out of town. But today I want to talk about some really interesting topics, how Outriders was actually supposed to look like, what we got in the meantime, and some of the fears that People Can Fly had before the game's release, during development, and how they actually came to be realized, some of them at the very least. And then I also want to talk about some really awesome concepts that we could expect to see in Outriders someday, especially now that the game is faring especially amazing. Even with the Game Pass, it's one of the top paid games over there, so really overall amazing news. Let's talk about all of that here in this video. So I want to start things off specifically with a couple of articles which pretty much reference the exact same interview with the game's creative director, where they pretty much mention how Outriders devs were afraid loot and numbers would scare players off. Specifically, People Can Fly was worried that players would worry too much about getting the highest stat numbers in Outriders. Does that sound familiar to you? Because it should, especially if you're already in the end game and you're already doing pretty much that. So here is what the creative director from People Can Fly had to say about this. Of course, figuring out Outriders loot system began with a pretty conscious decision back in 2016 as the studio worked to figure out what title it would be working on next. Surveying the competition, they said that the team became conscious of how many other shooters on the market have begun to integrate loot systems like Borderlands, The Division, and beyond. And of course, how Borderlands and The Division and other similar games were quite the inspiration for People Can Fly. So we realized that those other games that still had loot were still more shooters than system-driven games, explaining that in many of these games you don't have a lot of freedom to create your builds and play with it. Again, does it sound familiar? Because it definitely should in today's context. There was a lot of confidence at the studio that they could put out a competent shooter, but to properly understand a good loot system, they expanded the range of games they were studying to figure out what worked and what didn't. The competition, as Khraze put it, expanded to older titles like Final Fantasy X so that the team could merge fantasy games with shooter games, which I think is also relevant in how we look at the guns, even though some of them might not look that interesting from a DPS point of view or for expedition clearing, but they all seem to be very high fantasy compared to how the world in Outriders is, and they definitely look a lot more outworldish compared to your pretty much basic planet, which is an alien planet, but the weapons just look way better than anything else, is what I'm trying to say. Now, loot in Outriders goes beyond just pushing a player's character's raw stats like damage, health, armor, etc. higher and higher. It also helps players experiment with the different abilities that come with each of the game's 4 classes. You have to build your game around the loot, or you don't have a loot based game, you have a shooter with loot in addition to it. And they gave credit to developers who found interesting twists in the space, but said that in their research they found that players wanted more agency and ability to experiment with their playable characters. Now, why is this relevant? It's relevant because they pretty much ended a little bit in the exact scenario they were kind of fearing from. So right now it's true that for the majority of the game, up until you reach high-end expeditions, you can literally make most of the builds work. As a matter of fact, even in high-end expeditions, you can make a lot of builds work, not just weapon-related builds. And I think that Nick too over on YouTube is making a ton of really amazing build guides that kind of showcase exactly that. There's a lot of anomaly builds that he's covering, and all of them are really high impact, really fun to play, and still behave amazingly well, at the very least in some of the challenge tier 15 expeditions that most people are running for max rewards. But it's undeniable that right now the game is a little bit skewed in the favor of weapon-centric builds, especially because the mods, the combinations of mods, and especially so the way you interact with the enemies in combat kind of favor this type of playstyle. Or should I say not even favor, let's just say that it's more convenient to play that way. But speaking of players' behavior, Khraze broke down how early early on it was difficult to get players to conceive of the game's loot as impacting their abilities. He described how early playtesters would equip items that were of a higher level and distinctly showed a higher power level, but they would still feel weaker and die. That was super hard in the beginning for us. We tried to make it work. We changed the distribution of the loot to try and help players understand our game takes a different approach. We were a little bit afraid because if people look at the game and go, okay, the numbers drive the gameplay, would fail because people would be failing and people would not be playing. Again, it kinda is similar to the situation you are in, especially before just reaching challenge tier 15. Before just reaching that point, you're essentially into a numbers game. Even if you get the best gear possible, like the highest eye level and whatnot, unless it is with the proper stats on it, you're not going to feel any more powerful. You're just going to maybe even feel weaker even compared to your lower tier items because you don't have the proper stats on them. But at the same time, the scaling is ruining a portion of it, because even though in theory you should grow stronger as you're getting new items with higher eye levels and these stats, sometimes the weird scaling, especially one level below, kind of ruins that, as it brings your stats down, but it doesn't bring it down in a cohesive kind of way, at least not enough to properly balance you back again to where you were before, and when you were able to actually finish that expedition or that piece of content in the first place. Now, I would mostly attribute this to bugs, but it still proves the point that some of the fears that they had still came true. And this is a pretty interesting bit right here that I want to cover. Another struggle with these early playtesters was that in the earliest game development, there weren't plans for classes at all. Players would pick from a pool of abilities to create their own characters and use loot to augment those abilities, which actually sounds really interesting. Can you imagine that we only had one character but 4 different specializations? Like, imagine combining some of the abilities from the Trickster with that of the Devastators, or maybe something like a Technomancer with a few abilities from the Pyromancer, which again sounds really awesome. But the problem was, again, players were building such unrealistic builds. It's not hard to see how someone might grab, say, abilities from the Devastator class meant to tank and soak up damage at close range, and the Technomancer meant to support from long range, and realize they don't work well together. So that's why they went with the idea of actually breaking it down into 4 different classes so that they can avoid this entire issue in the first place. So yeah, Outriders could have been a completely different game. Like, imagine how cool it would have been to have something like this, but I get the idea of splitting that down into 4 different classes in this game. It totally makes sense, but yeah, that's still interesting to think about. Now, speaking of multiple classes, let's talk about the case of new playable classes in DLCs. Now, we know that the game has fared really well. Right now, if you look at the Steam charts, the game is still hanging very well, almost 20 days after its release. Now, this is pretty big for Outriders. It already broke a couple of records. It's one of the most played games on the Xbox Game Pass, even though it was paid. It was a huge success over there as well. Also on Steam, because of some of the recent fixes with the wipes and whatnot, a lot of people came back again, and they reckon that after they implement the restoration, even more will drop back into it. So in that context, a very big case right here is with the playable classes in the supposed DLC that hopefully we should get sometimes in the future. So there's a few really bright ideas over here that Game Rant comes with that I do want to talk about. There's a few concept ideas over here that, actually thinking about it, they would work really well. And starting from the idea of how the Technomancer is a summoner of sorts, like use the turrets, they kind of act a bit like minions, though not too much. What about a Beastmaster class is what Game Rant is suggesting, especially since there's a ton of creatures on Enoch. Surely somebody out there would be able to tame at least one of them, especially, you know, the hunter that gives you all of these like hunt missions. He would definitely be an expert in this regard. So what if he introduced us to a new way of playing a new class, kind of like this Beastmaster? So in this case, perhaps it would be able to summon some of these creatures to attack enemies, have nature abilities that include vine trap, grabs and movements, and general bonuses regarding to wildlife on Enoch. Now, just like in the case of the Technomancer, a Beastmaster will likely join them in mastering long-range aspects of Outriders, so that the Pyromancer really needs an ally as well in the middle range aspect, and they pretty much come up with up to 8 classes that could exist in the game. So like, judging by elements of Hinduism, they say we kind of already have like fire with the Pyromancer, earth with the Devastator, we have water slightly, they mention with with the Technomancer because you can freeze enemies and whatnot, and then there's also like the space manipulation with the Trickster. But what about another mid-range class on top too? Maybe something that would control air or even void. And we do kind of have a void ability in the game that some of the captains use, which kind of puts this black hole that sucks you in and teleports you right in front of them, where they can more easily take you down, which actually sounds really interesting. I would really love to see some of these concepts happening in Outriders, but of course it doesn't mean that it's all upsides. There are some downsides as well, and the article mentions later on about how this actually worked like in games like Borderlands. And Borderlands 2 got some really amazing DLC classes, but unfortunately they were never as played as the original ones. Like, just like how Gearbox even eventually concluded, DLC classes simply don't do well, which is also the reason why Borderlands 3 did not get any new classes, but instead got new specs for the existing classes. So here is my question to you at the end of this video: what would you prefer more? Would you prefer a new class in Outriders every new DLC, or would you prefer new specs for all of the existing classes and maybe new abilities on top as well? I would be really curious to see what your opinion is on this one. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.